Hi, I'm Adrian Strittmatter. Welcome to Bricks and More. I'm the CEO and co-founder of SAENTYS, a global creative consultancy specializing in destinations, real estate, and the hospitality sector. Bricks and More is all about exploring how to generate, unlock, and maximize real estate value. Our mission is to challenge outdated and limiting notions of how this is done. In each episode, we talk to top professionals to uncover innovative strategies that drive short, medium, and long-term gains. So if you're passionate about making real estate more valuable for more people, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bricks and More. Today, we'll be focusing on a key but often underestimated value driver in real estate, brand and marketing. In a sector that can sometimes be uniquely product-led and sales-driven, how do you create meaningful, long-term connections with your audiences? How do you turn an asset into a destination or a development into a brand that people remember, engage with, and choose time and time and time again? So in this episode, I want to dig into how branding and marketing generate lasting value for tenants, communities, and for investors. As such, I'm thrilled to welcome Emma Collings, Head of Marketing at British Land, a strategic and creative leader delivering high-performing marketing across one of the UK's most significant real estate portfolios. With a career spanning real estate, retail, finance, social enterprise, and beyond, Emma brings rare cross-sector insight to the way places are positioned, experienced, and remembered. Emma's work elevates brand equity while delivering measurable value across assets, occupiers, communities, and the mothership corporate brand, which is British Land. So let's dive straight in. Emma, welcome to Bricks and More.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That's quite right. A great pleasure. Just wanted to start off with some questions around your personal journey. How did you end up in real estate and in the real estate sector?
Well, I've actually moved around quite a bit, and coming into British Land, I had a phone call just to say, look, they're looking at retail in particular, and I'd come from quite a long stint in a retailer side, and so I put my CV in, and that's how I ended up joining British Land. But if you'd said from the beginning, would I end up in real estate, I would have questioned that quite hugely, actually.
But no regrets?
No regrets at all. I mean, I've always worked in marketing, but it's been everything from kind of social enterprise, retail, and now it's real estate, and this stint's been 9 years, so it's pretty long time, really.
And from that cross-sector expertise that you mentioned, what are the things that you think you've brought to real estate branding and marketing? Because sometimes it has, over the past, been viewed as quite staid and quite traditional. How has that helped you bring some dynamism to that element of the industry?
So, firstly, I'm hugely respectful of the real estate marketing because it's really quite complex. The stakeholders change throughout it. So I think that's the starting point of why I've enjoyed it for so long. The bit from retail, coming from retail, was you are so heavily focused on the customer, their needs and their wants, and that comes back to you weekly. So in terms of like the pace of retail, the consumers, how they behave, if you get that wrong, you know that on a Monday morning when you come in. And I think that element of you have a particular audience that you're looking at for real estate, what is it that you want them to know, and making sure that you're following that through the journey. So I think it's complemented to say it's complex, there's loads of stakeholders, but understanding who you're trying to influence because of the consumer side has been really helpful, certainly from a retail perspective.
And do you feel that those rules kind of apply as well to the more B2B side of the marketing you've been doing?
Absolutely. So I think B2B is going to go in a really interesting direction over the next kind of 10 years, where you know your audience and you should know them very, very well. But the creativity element of getting their interest is going to be harder. And so you tend to find in B2B audiences that they operate in quite closed networks, but the opening up of information and the opening up of digital means you're actually fighting quite a lot for visibility, that awareness piece, before you even got into the sales approach, sales and marketing approach. And so you can't rest as easily on your laurels as you would almost like a consumer, like they'll switch off in a second. And I think a B2B audience isn't going to be that much different, actually.
And would you say in terms of your role and the way that you see it developing, what would you say is that audience piece or another piece what excites you the most at the moment?
Absolutely. I mean, people. So that behaviour of people, I think people are absolutely fascinating. And when you see them at all different points of what they do, it's brilliant. And so if you take like the life cycle of a building where you go into planning and then you're going into like there's a development piece and then you want to activate it, those stakeholders, those audiences change. And so your primary audience of who you're going for will also have a secondary audience that's trying to influence them. And it's getting that, I think, getting that balance right between what's creative, where's your spend, how do you prove the impact of it? It's inevitably harder in a B2B audience because it's often such a long sales funnel to a certain extent. But it's also hugely rewarding because it can be far more targeted and segmented in a different way to, say, retail and consumer.
That's really interesting because I think also because of the portfolio that you have and the mixed use element of that portfolio, you could have someone at different touch points on, let's say, an estate, acting as a retail consumer, F&B consumer, but then going back into the office and being more on the B2B side.
Absolutely. And a really good example of that is Broadgate. You know, that is 32 acres. It's predominantly office workspace. But those people will leave for 15 minutes. They will go out and get their lunch. They will go and have, meet their friends for a meal in the evening. They'll go and do some shopping. Your needs change and your wants change throughout that day. And that's that campus idea of fulfilling someone's lifestyle, but knowing that the dominant part of that is the working environment to start. But then flip that to a retail environment like Meadowhall, which we investment manage. You'd be looking at it from, are they here for destination shopping? Are they here to pop in because they're more local? So the behaviours change. So you go back to people again. You constantly go back to people and behaviour. Yeah.
And sort of circling maybe back a little bit and going to sort of one of the core things that we're trying to discover on the podcast, which is around sort of identifying and generating value for an asset, as you said, for the investors, for the stakeholders, for the community and the visitors and tenants. How would you encapsulate that sentence about identifying and generating value in the context of branding and marketing?
So I almost like split it into two parts. Generating value for a business is getting your product right and selling it at the price that you would need for the business. Okay, so that is ultimately what we're looking at. The broader piece, which I love about real estate, is there is legacy attached to it. So some of the decisions that you make, the responsible decisions, are very different to potentially other industries because it's around for so much longer, and as it should be. But when you look at that from creating value, that means there is creating business value and then there's creating community value. So one of the most rewarding parts of my role has absolutely been working with our sustainability teams, environmental and social, because you're faced with how do you engage like a local community? How do you bring them in? Because it has a much more long-term impact. You almost got a guardianship over space versus completely owning it in its entirety with the need to generate the business value. But that is about making it the right place for people.
And then in terms of the decisions to, and this is maybe a more sort of investment-led question, but in terms of holding the asset or exiting the asset, there is also that long-term element of saying, even if we do exit the asset, you will be passing on that legacy piece and that long-term vision to the potential new owner or new steward of that property.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's why it's called life cycle, I suppose, is that we will come in at a particular moment, do what we do, the British land effect to a certain extent, and then when it's ready, it can move on. But it's not a quick, that I don't think it's necessarily quick in real estate in terms. So we've got really long holdings. If you take Regent's Place, we've been there for such a number of years making those changes. It's certainly different in terms of the life cycle that you'd find on a consumer side. And I think that's the bit where it's really differed for me in my own career.
Again, going back, we talked about very quickly how you measured the value, it's sort of the selling the product at the right price. But how do you then, in terms of the marketing and the branding side of it, it's a question that we always get asked at the agency as well. How do you measure, why should I invest this money? What's the ROI? How do you measure that marketing and branding success?
Yeah. So measure it in terms of, ultimately we are supporting a leasing function if you're going to take the pure business approach, which means making sure that all the material that's needed is available for them. And that could be anything from fly-throughs to CGIs to brochures to the tours that you have to launch an asset. they are very key deliverables. You either did them or you didn't at a particular time.
Yeah.
The brand bit becomes slightly more complex because you can't land like a spaceship in certain parts. So you have to be really considerate of, yes, we want to bring something to market, but how does it reflect the values of the people that are there and the people that are going to be coming? And so I think you're getting closer into the reputation of like, what's your behaviour, what type, where you're going to serve this information, and therefore what's your message, and making sure you land that quite well. And that's where I would see the difference between the two, is that you can't just walk in and decide that you're going to do it in a complete way. It's much more considered and intentional because of the people that you're impacting.
And then asset by asset, and then also how would that work in relation to the overarching sort of British Land listed company, British Land, British listed company brand?
It's probably easier to talk in levels. You've got kind of British Land, master brand, if we're going to go into terms of like, we're really good at what we do in terms of investing, developing, making sure that those changes come and they come in the right way. You then go down into effectively like product divisions, so retail, offices, residential, and then they will have what is it that we do that reinforces our position at a British Land level. And then when you get down to a place, that is very much, that lives and breathes. And that can be anything from, that's the customer you're trying to get in, the business, but then also the people, the users, the consumers that are using that space. And it's remembering that, well, there's two questions I learned quite early on in my career, which is like, what's the story? How do you want it to land? And if you answer those questions against your key audience, you'll go, oh, I've got a bit of a gap here. This is not going to go very well. And I think that's the broader piece of thinking about how could it impact if I make those decisions. But it's making sure that the people around the table, there are different voices around there, because it's too easy to make a mistake if you go, well, I think it should be this, and that's what we're going to do.
This is maybe a sidetrack, but going back to the British Land brand, the story that you want to tell and how is it going to land, how useful or how is British Land perceived in the market at those different levels? I think we're both very clear on a B2B level. How well known is it on a B2C level?
Well, not particularly, but you will have interacted with our spaces. And I think there's an element of modesty that I like working for British Land, is that how much does everybody need to know everything? And so there is, if you want to speak to us, you want to find us out, absolutely. But do we need to be Coca-Cola? No. And so that's where you have to be really careful, I think, where your customer is and where you're influencing, like we talk about key decision makers and your influencers around the table. That is very targeted, but that's the same in every industry. I think quite often when people look at consumer, and this is my retail hat back on, is, well, everyone knows who they are. That might be true, but they are targeting in on a particular audience and then influencing what's around them. And so coming back to, I was at Pandora Jewellery before. The person that wears the jewellery is somebody, but the people that buy the jewellery are very different. So you would expect it to have much more broader consumer impact. That's not necessary for every industry. It's important that people know the places and they interact with the places. Is it important they know every single level of that, and how much are you prepared to put money behind it? That's very different. And those are the discussions you have within the business.
Yeah, because you can see different developers and landlords trialing out different things.
Yes.
And seeing whether they have a consumer-facing side to their brand.
And sometimes it does. Sometimes it makes sense to do that. But ultimately, I think if you go back to the customer needs and wants, like, what do I want to know? What do I need to know? If I need to find it out, what's available, you'll come up with the right answers to that. And we've had examples of where, certainly in retail, so if you think when I sat retail side, I would have interacted with the other big landlords and developers in that role, where those have come in fully branded everything, not necessarily still here today. So you kind of, you can learn the hard way as well. But those assets are still going on, and they're still being regenerated, and people still see them as part of the places that they live.
It's interesting as well, isn't it? Because you've got different ambassadors, I would say, for the British Land brand. You've got obviously your different assets, and then you've also productized, haven't you?
Yes.
Across different sort of, let's say, office products as well.
Well, it meets the needs of lifestyle. So, of course, we create best-in-class workspace. So that could be your huge HQ for a hedge fund, or that could be the more flexible offering of Story as you're growing as a established SME, but you're really scaling. And I think that's what's interesting about real estate. You're having those discussions early on, and then you haven't got businesses moving in for maybe 4, 5, 6, 10 years. We've just completed one at Broadgate, and it takes a long time to build something of that scale.
And so that's a really interesting one with regards to sort of generating value through the brand and the marketing. There's this one question about how do you separate high performing marketing campaigns and brands versus the sort of forgettable ones. What would you say? Are there any sort of key rules that people can follow?
I'll
or
say
3
2.
key points? Oh, 2? Good, even better.
Creative and data. We can notice patterns in data very quickly. Like, is it landing? Is it not landing? This is the beauty of marketing now in terms of you can check all of that. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you did your testing. It cost you probably a fortune to do it. You went live, and you could, to a certain extent, you crossed your fingers because it's a kind of an art and science piece. The bit here is, I still believe in the 1 second rule of advertising, that I need to command someone's attention very quickly to continue with that discussion with them. And if you have that in the back of your mind of just see the creative and see what happens in terms of how people feel around the table, that has been really helpful to me. But then you back it with the data of the testing. But if you start to sit with creative and go, well, it kind of ticks this box and it ticks that box and it does it, you start to convince yourself, and ultimately your audience are going to look at it very quickly and go yes or no.
Yes or no, yeah.
Instinctively. And that's where it gets hard.
And another probably unanswerable question maybe, but how many yes and no's do you need? And let's assume they're yeses before you see conversion, or that you've seen that data radically changing with the recurring messages or brands?
That's a really good question. I think some of it's experience on consumer of going, I think that's going to work and not going to work, and this is what I'm looking for. So when I talk about the paciness of retail in particular, you learn, it starts to become inbuilt because you're doing so many different versions of this over a number of years. How many yeses and nos? I think people start to spend longer looking at something, or they are, certainly from a digital perspective, it's
the more they see it?
The more they see it.
Okay.
So you kind of have to test. I think there's an element of, do they stop? Do they remember it? Does anyone talk to you about it? But you can do that from an internal perspective before it's even gone anywhere. So I think that bit of your internal audience is really important in marketing, because if people from the business don't necessarily recognise it, you might not have it quite right as you're going out. The other bit of how the advocacy part of not only people seeing it, spending time looking at it, what happens behind your websites, what happens on social media, are people engaging with it? You start to see the patterns. If you're only taking one area of that and trying to form the answers, no, but it paints a picture. And part of marketing's job is to look at some of those patterns and interpret them. And
going sort of back to the asset, and as you said, sort of there's a very specific relationship between the British Land mother brand and then the specific assets that you choose to brand.
Yeah.
How would you say, or marketing and branding can help reposition in the eyes of the specific audience they want to target? How can you help reposition that asset to give it, as you said, a new lease of life, a new purpose within a community? How have you seen that working?
Well, it's understanding, how do people see something now, and how would you like them to see it? And then taking people on that journey, and how quickly a business wants to move, then that's where you start to build your marketing budget in the middle. Like if you want to get there fast, that's quite a relatively heavy budget, lots of activities, lots of tracking through that. It's very close management. If it is actually, this is going to grow relatively organically, you don't have to necessarily be jumping in and putting huge amounts of money behind it. And those are the decisions I think most businesses are making, because in an ideal world, you do it for everything. But we have to be understanding of what the business environment is at that time, and then where we need to intercept or support. But ultimately, if you have one product and you're going to change it into something else, there is going to be a need to communicate well. And marketing and comms is what forms that basis. And ultimately, the brand is business strategy, and then how do you communicate it through your audiences?
Do you think there's sometimes a disconnect between sort of product positioning and brand positioning?
Yes.
Yeah.
Brand position is absolutely born from business strategy. What are we trying to achieve overall and how do we get there? Product positioning is a smaller sector of that. And if you only do product, you're not necessarily reinforcing the broader piece. And it doesn't give you flexibility to move if it's just pure product all the time.
And so to create that long-lasting value, and this is obviously maybe a bit of a directed question, I don't know, when do you see the best moment for people, including yourselves or ourselves, involved in brand? When do they start? In an ideal world?
In an ideal world, it's at the beginning, isn't it? So if I was going to give you one thing that surprised me, when you're in a consumer environment, marketing's one of the first people at the table, because how that is communicated outside is so crucial to selling week after week after week at the levels. In real estate, it's harder. Sometimes it's great to be around the table, but you won't always necessarily recognise how early on it would help in that process. But I think that's B2B audiences, that's B2B businesses generally.
In general, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of that is once you're dealing with high value, it's a much longer timeline and can be a lot harder. There's so many different plans that go on the table to start with.
And in a very meaningful way, have you seen brand and marketing people being at the table right at the beginning who have had an ability to actually even influence the way that the product looks and feels? I mean, we've had times where we've had to, on certain mandates, do product market fit. Yeah. So before they start building, they do go and test it. I mean, have you seen that happening?
It's starting to happen, but no, not in the depth you would do in other industries, I think. That's a really good question. There are so many twists and turns in real estate. I don't think it's not as linear as you would expect it in other places. So I'm not sure I would see that as necessary as a criticism. I think it's the nature of something that lives and breathes and takes a long time to bring to market.
And in terms of, so those twists and turns obviously follow kind of the asset life cycle.
Yes.
How have you seen the role of brand and marketing to be able to create value along that asset life cycle? Have you seen that changing, extending, where the brand stories have been used for various purposes, from speaking to the community during the development to leasing and then to activation?
Well, telling the story. So I think if anything, I take Norton Folgate, which is not too far from here actually, is you've got the architect story, design, you've got the construction story, craftsmanship, you've got the behavioural part of the science, the science part of how should people behave in space, what should it look like. There are so many different players in this. It's almost, if I could run the credits on a building, it'd be like running the credits on a film type thing. And I think those stories could be told in an even stronger way. And that's probably this shared, from a marketing perspective, this shared media of actually showing everyone's contribution in the same way you would do on a film perhaps. And everyone they want to create the best. They bring their expertise in various different areas, whether that's the lifts or whether that's the cobblestones. But it's so intentional and so considered. Those are the stories that we can tell much better, certainly from a marketing and brand perspective. Yeah.
And then, so maybe going in asset by asset, how do you ensure the tie-up between the asset-specific brands or even the product ones that we mentioned, like stories?
Yes.
What are your metrics to make sure that they are in line or that they feel part of the British Land family or brand family, for lack of a better definition?
I think there's more of a look and feel between British Land and British Land divisions, more so than between the divisions and the place.
Okay.
Because if you take Glasgow Fort, it's almost like a next generation retail park, trying to look like Paddington Central, but the audience that's going there, it starts to feel a bit more uncomfortable. So you end up with there are things that naturally will overlap, but you don't want to end up in the position where you turn up somewhere and go, well, I thought this was my space, but that looks like my space. And it goes back to that customer and user again of what should and shouldn't it look like for the people that want to use that space. And I come back to the retail side of we've seen try to like pre-stamp everything unless the product is exactly the same for the customers and their wants and needs. It's actually quite unusual to brand everything exactly the same.
And in terms of the B2B audience, going back to that slightly as well, in terms of making sure it's not necessarily only about creating value, but that they see value in the product. Have you seen, going back to the marketing and the branding and the campaign side of things, more and more we're going to call kind of business profiling or business personalization to make sure that when you're going to talk to an audience to say, let's say to a business about a building, that you are able to target the different units within that business. So whether it's HR, whether it's brand and sustainability, you finding that that kind of sub-messaging is being used quite a lot, sorry?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why messaging is quite complex, of understanding who's going to make the final decision, but who's going to influence around the table. And fortunately, we live in a world where there is so much information coming out, and there's technology now where you can actually see what does the position of a business want to have very quickly. But of course, HR, finance, procurement, sustainability, they're all around those tables, and we need to be prepared, and that's where bespoke material is created. You know, this is high value stuff, so it's worth putting the effort in. It's absolutely worth putting the effort in.
And in terms of sort of, I would say, mandates that you are the most proud of in terms of seeing, as you said, that lasting legacy, have you got case studies where there's been that repositioning and that you can see that vision taking form and that momentum growing over time?
Yes, and I think this is where British Land team across the board are brilliant, and the people that work there, the colleagues that we work with, are spectacular. If you take Broadgate as an example, I joined, 2016, 2017. The aspiration and what it is today, we're coming to the end almost with the one Broadgate being just PC'd and 2FA being come together. You can really see the change from this city kind of like institution to some place that people just hang out and enjoy. Walking through the Circle today, you see it almost feels quite European on a summer's day, like within the city of London.
Al fresco.
Exactly. And I think I walked past Exchange Square and it's school holidays. So there's like a couple of kids like paddling in the pool. Like could you reverse that to the 1980s? That just wouldn't happen.
No way. Yeah.
So that's an example. I think that's a really good example of what British Land has done well. But equally, when you look at the people that come into the different places across the country and how it services their life, that's part of the job. But it takes time, and it takes time for people to feel comfortable in those places if they haven't necessarily been there before. And I come back to, during COVID, we've got a theatre at Regent's Place called New Diorama Theatre. Brilliant, punches well above its weight in terms of what it delivers creatively within the UK. During COVID, created NDT Broadgate, which was a place, like a couple of floors within an office, an office building for rehearsals for some of the theatre production companies, about 700 of them, so it's quite a lot. And I think what a response to space in terms of what was going on in COVID, and what came out of that was some great theatre productions that went up and down the country. That's a good example of creating value, but in a different way at a time when we all had to do things in a very different way. So there are those small stories that I think are great stories to tell about responsible business. And then there are the bigger stories to tell, which is the business bit when you start to get to investors. That is how you're making your money and how you're delivering that type of value.
And then going back to Broadgate, because I think it's a really interesting example, and you mentioned before it felt quite European, which then brought me to a bit of a mind struggle, which is I am still trying to find a European business campus, for lack of a better word, which has the feel that Broadgate has. I think they're still, I would say, arguably, not all of them, obviously, but some of the ones that we've visited through our work, still on that journey where you guys are kind of getting to the end of it. What informed that journey? Obviously, there are different ways of interacting at work, socially, loads of different requirements. But what do you think changed Going from the 80s snapshot
Yeah.
to the paddling pool snapshot, for lack of a better metaphor.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of bravery and boldness
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of planning.
Listed company.
Yeah, from a listed company.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, coming into British Land, those discussions are already taking place and looking at what could we create, what could the amenity offer be for office campus workers, what was the desire from the City of London in terms of what they wanted to do across London. And this is why I often talk about guardianship, that there is a lot that comes from the business, but there's also a lot of external stakeholders that are part of that journey as well. So it's far broader. And it's interesting you should say that, because we are proud of the campuses because of that mix and the feel that you have from them and what sets them apart from other places which are dominant for office or workspace. So, and the market responds very well to that, because you can walk onto Broadgate, you can walk onto Paddington, you can walk onto Regents, and if you take even what's been happening at Canada Water, which is a broader regeneration, you can feel the difference in the development and the changes that are there.
And going on to Canada Water then.
I thought you would after that. Yeah, I mentioned it.
Easy segue. Thanks, Emma. Obviously, that's a slightly, as you said, slightly different proposal, where there's a lot of, let's say, Broadgate reinvention here. There's a lot of invention.
Yes.
How, in terms of the future-proofing, which is virtually impossible, obviously, because we never know, but the future looking, let's say, how does that process work at British Land in terms of saying, this is what's going to create the most value for the community, this is what creating a great place in XYZ when it's developed? How does that work?
So Canada Water is a really interesting one, and I haven't worked on it that closely until quite recently, really. But I did read about it in the British Land book when I first came, so it is noted in terms of how we approach things.
Diligence.
I did my due diligence. I bought the book from Amazon. I've got it. And actually, what's really good is you create these British Land creates these teams. It kick-starts it and turbocharges it, and then it starts to develop out. So if you take Canada Water, it's been many years in the making, and you've got Roger Madeline, King's Cross, the team there they're phenomenal. But once again, you talk about future-proofing, it's London. It's so central. It's like a couple of stops from Waterloo. Our job is to make sure that people realise that. So the fundamentals are there. And so you come back to marketing and branding, which is even the subtlety of saying, what do people think of? Well, you don't say Waterloo, London, you say London, Waterloo, and everyone goes, right, you're in central London. That was, the Westfield strategy was to say, we're going to call ourselves Westfield London. And you knew, but it was in Shepherd's Bush. So you start to work out what is it that people start to respond to understand what it is that you're creating. And that's part of the innovation part. You're bringing something that people don't yet understand, but they need to, and you want to speed that up.
And in terms of the mix of asset classes down at Canada Water then, how is that? I mean, that's a subtle balance as well, isn't it? Of mixing those things across the development pipeline as well, with meanwhile space and so on and so forth, to try and give a sense of what the place will be in the future.
And it needs flexibility to change, because if we go back over the past 10 years of everything, I mean, I left university, the financial crash happened, and I thought, great, that's it, we're done now. We've done that big financial bang. And it's going to keep coming. And
There's a few more.
Yeah, and so when you think about the expertise of a developer or a landlord, it's about saying, this is where we are now. This is what it looks like going forward. What's the flexibility? And you can see that in the office portfolio from going, there's a lot more flex space. I mean, we called that back in 2016, 2017 with Stories. So it's kind of, you've got to be looking ahead and looking at lifestyles and behaviour and the change and noticing those patterns. And I'm not going to lay claim that that's marketing, but that's the marketing function.
Oh, come on.
But it's certainly...
We helped.
But certainly from a business perspective of having that, it's obviously having the insights behind it, but it's London, it's living and breathing, and it's being respectful of that.
And are there any sort of examples that you have within the British Land portfolio of assets or products that were really struggling in the market that really benefited from or a change of perception thanks to brand and marketing? Let's say the product, without changing necessarily the product or the approach, but just like needed to sit down, have a think about it, changed, as you said, the narrative, and it completely transformed the kind of fortunes, if it were, of this asset.
So I'm going to bring you back to So marketing branding, I came in on the retail side of the portfolio. And when I think of how we influence key decision makers, it's everything from thought leadership, research papers, people often think about advertising and it's broader. And it was retail parks, true value of stores. If I go back and say the research that was released, true value of stores, it was like, it's over, everything's online, everything's going to be online, nothing's going to change. The success of retail parks is actually looking at the market and seeing the change in consumer and lifestyle behaviour. And Glasgow Fort, Teesside Park, Fort Kinnaird, they are next generation retail parks. They're outdoor shopping centres to a certain extent. So when we certainly coming in as a retailer, I was like, what is this? You're either in a shopping centre or you're not.
Or you're not.
And I think changing the perception of how it's spoken about and what type of brands, 10 years ago, you would not have had some of the big fashion brands at some of these locations. That is progression and change. And the occupancy is what, 99% for British Land? But yet, if you flip back to the true value of stores, of us saying, these stores are going to be really valuable, we have felt the pressure of e-commerce, but things will settle. And I suppose it's a bit like physics. Even if it swings completely one way, it's likely to land somewhere in the middle. And those are the patterns that are being looked at.
No, that's a really good point, because we always, especially when COVID happened and even before, viewed working from home or shopping online to present similar risks to the asset classes that they influenced. So you've given me another really nice segue with regards to retail parks. Are you guys also shifting the narrative, the perception around offices? Or do you think there's a slower than expected but also natural progression back to offices? How are you viewing that?
No, I think we operate in a world of media and discussions and pros and cons and everything. The truth is, retail, if I come to retail parks, is they fulfill a part in people's lifestyle. And when you are able to go and get something and shop across something, it's a lot easier. The idea that would all completely go and there wouldn't be anything else is too too much of a general statement. And if you look in the retail classes, so your high streets to your shopping centres to your retail parks, to say retail's failing is just way too much of a generalisation, just generally. So general statements I don't tend to particularly like because they're not particularly helpful. But then when you come to offices, once again, you're turbocharging your business. Is that better when people are together and they can hash it out and disagree? If you're fortunate enough to be in a business where no one disagrees, I mean, that's quite an interesting place to be. But what does that mean in terms of changing things and pushing things forward? And technology does a lot for us, there's no doubt about it. And I'm sure you'll segue into AI at some stage in this discussion. But the idea, I think we're starting to learn that the idea that it's going to come in and replace things entirely, move things around and change it, absolutely, but replace entire no. But you do need to have like the little speedboats ahead saying what will change, how is it going to change, how does, going back to your product, are you giving something to the market that you've got the needs and wants for, and how you're going to communicate that. And you're always coming back into even messaging, which is a core part of marketing.
No, completely. And I think on a previous episode, what I found interesting is that one of our guests had talked to a big retail CEO, and this was, pretty eye-opening, which said that they made more money from their bricks and mortar stores than they did online, and that the online element was the actual advertising flagship, but the actual moneymaker were the bricks and mortar.
Absolutely, and I could tell you that from firsthand. So the way part of Pandora Jewelry's growth strategy was, so it came in wholesale in jewellers, then it decided to go franchise, and then it decided to go owner-operated. That happened in a very short space of time. But to open up stores, you'd be looking at what's the activity in the local area, Google search at the time, and you would know that there was really good indications that if you popped a store in that space, that the search interest would, yes, generate e-com spend, but it'd also generate spend within the store.
Within the physical store, yeah.
And that was seen, that's over 10 years ago now. So the idea of, that's why it's important to understand what's going on in search around your product, because it doesn't necessarily mean that they immediately want to buy online, but it certainly means that a certain area has particular interest in it, and therefore there's an opportunity and a need. And don't forget that physical interaction is quite often more memorable than tech interaction. So you can end up with great customer service in a place. Will your return? You might buy more on like elements online, but that piece around, can you push the basket price up? Can you bring someone? It's a very different environment, and that's why it's quite theatre driven, and that impacts real estate across the board. That's not just retail.
And I think that's really interesting, because that always brings me back to one of my random anecdotes. We used to do a lot of delivery with one of the big retailers, and what I found is that the actual delivery drivers who would bring your shopping to the door were actually the only human interaction that you'd have with that brand. And I felt they were constantly, and maybe it's just a personal experience, but also really good sales reps.
Yes.
They were super helpful, and they basically became delivery drivers and brand ambassadors at the same time.
Yes, those front-facing roles are so important, and they come in so many different shapes and sizes. And I think even core things like your postman and those types of roles where you're interacting, they will become even more important. They'll become even more important in your life.
And your brand, so that's really interesting. And like the human-facing side of, I would say, a British land property that you're experiencing, what would be those touch points?
Well, absolutely. When you go in, if you're an office, into reception, like that, friendly smile and someone being able to direct you somewhere. But you've had the tech element, as in how to get there, making sure in the right place. So if you're taking a customer journey, there are moments where digital and tech play a role, and there are moments where people play a role. And that's the same even in retail. So some of it's us, some of it's the brands and the customers, but those interactions are constant throughout your journey there.
In terms of sort of, and we are getting to AI, the shifts, we've talked about the more and more prevalence, as you mentioned, on data, and especially audience data.
Yes.
But how are you seeing sort of tech, namely AI, influencing the ways that you produce marketing content, but also the ways that you reach out and get out to the audiences?
I mean, AI is spectacular, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we're in this. I'm just studying from MBA at the moment, so I've got a lecturer who says it's equal threat and opportunity, which is a really exciting place to be, but not for the faint-hearted, because making sure you get certain elements right, it's once again noticing patterns. So you can speed up, you can turbocharge some of the delivery of the items, certainly in the material. You have to be careful that once your prompts are right and what comes out is truly reflective of the type of audience you're going to. And I think if you're a business that is looking at next generation, it's not going to be the average of the average that comes out of ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini. So it's just your first pass is excellent. It gets you started, and then you lift. That's where I'd see the importance coming from. The bit around here is training models on your own business data. So WeTransfer have just come out in the past kind of couple of days. They've said if anyone sends anything via WeTransfer, we're going to own it all, and we're going to train the models and everything. And it was, we don't use WeTransfer, but we might accept a WeTransfer. So you're immediately going, okay, what does this mean? Opens us up. That said, today they just announced, actually, sorry, that's the wrong communication that's gone out. Oops, exactly. But that's the level of volatility that we've got, is you still want to show the creativity. Anything that becomes homogenous, you will find that other brands start to lift it in a different way, and it just sets a new playing field, really. And there's a period of time where there is absolutely competitive advantage in really embracing that, with being really cautious about the risks that's associated with it. But I think that's a huge opportunity for marketing teams, definitely. You can get involved in so much more interesting, because kind of admin's kind of under control to a certain extent in a different way.
And specifically then also with regards to utilising those tools internally as well, on your sort of day-to-day, or the team's day-to-day within the marketing department, which would you say is the most prevalent?
So one of our favourite day-to-day and going forward, so it is prevalent. We use a software called ClickUp, which we love. So it's like a digital workspace, and our products are sitting within there, and we've got access. But what allows us to do is summarise something very quickly. So if you've got something that's happened over the past couple of years and different people have been involved in it, you can summarise it and get everything very quickly. I mean, we're talking like seconds versus trying to go, can you just give me a bit of an update on that? And can you write that out and send me an email? And what email was that attached to? Straight away. And then you can go into what are, almost like, what are the pros and cons of this? What could we do? Because there's never really a black and white answer on everything. It's got so many different elements to it. And That's been really helpful. And going back to the kind of product, the life cycle of an asset, if you're able to do that over a 5-year period, think how powerful that could be and how many mistakes could be avoided, but equally how many of the great things you did you could pull back and use again.
Yeah, that's really good. And also more mundane. I'm just thinking, you mentioned that as like my handover notes.
Well, and this is it. It has got rid of handover notes considerably. Well, you can say this is linked here, 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 and here, and then you go in, you can find it. And because the team's there, it just brings everyone together in a much easier way. You can get rid of those, right, we're going to sit down and do a big update meeting on this. And so that frees up time to do other things.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, what do they talk? It's 3 E's of AI, and that is the efficiency bit. But for me, the effectiveness is you can create something, see what they think an audience could react to it. I'm not going to say that you absolutely know, but you get more of an indication than what you did 15 years ago. We'd go, well, I've done quite a lot of this testing. I sat in this room and I listened to a focus group. Still hugely important. But you can do some of that testing before you then go into anything that's too big.
Yeah, no, completely. I agree. One, I don't know, key question I wanted to ask to close off, because we're both active in the branding and marketing space. I'd be quite interested to get your point on this. What do you think is the biggest myth that you hear around, real estate marketing, positive or negative, in terms of what you hear on a day-to-day basis?
The biggest myth.
That you're constantly having to go, no, that's not true.
I don't know if I want to say that it's discretionary spend in an investment company. No, I think it's often perceived as being quite fluffy. And I do think that is on us. That's on us, because when you're dealing with different people within the business, how you arrive at the table and talk about things, that value bit, like who's across the table, what's the value you want to talk about it. I could talk to you about brand, design, fonts, colours. Not many people want to have a chat with me about that.
Internally. No, definitely, yeah.
And that's fine. And I think that's the bit of, someone said, I know my marketing spend's great, but I don't know which half of it. That's not helped us at all in quoting things like that. But you can now show much more of a direct impact over a longer period of time. And the software and the tools that we have makes that a lot easier.
Yeah, no, completely.
But it comes down to who's the audience you're trying to go out to, what's their wants and needs, and making sure you're laser focused on them. And then the other bit of the broader audience that are going to influence, making sure that you've got those stages in place.
It's like designing metrics for every single sort of moment in time, isn't it, really?
Yes, yeah. And let's be frank, when we look at like reach stats and we go, 1 billion eyes on it, like no one quite understands stuff like that.
Yeah.
And breaking that down and saying, well, we're now in a world where you take X amount of communication in, we are trying to get this amount from somebody, becomes more understandable. So when you start to look at these big numbers, it makes more sense for people that aren't necessarily in this field. But I always think, say what you're going to say out loud and see to a particular, your own, I suppose, your tribe to a certain extent, the people around you that you can test things on and say, does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
And as an industry that is about communication, it's recognising that when it doesn't land, it's actually on us to communicate that a bit more.
And from an outside perspective, is there anything from other industries that you've seen that you feel could be really useful if used in a more prevalent way within real estate? I know real estate's super broad with B2B and B2C, but anything that you feel is still kind of missing?
I think it's developing. I think it's changing. I think it's a network that's opening out. And that piece is, once people can gather their own information, which is the tech and digital element, you have to supply more information in a way. And that's true of most B2B businesses of actually, you can get a lot of the information, so why not just open the doors and let it out to a certain extent? But I look at what I would class as brands and say, who did things differently, and will that change in like real estate? Will somebody jump ahead quite quickly? And I always give one of the examples I give is NASA. It's effectively an independent agency within the government, and we just accept that it's quite brand. You could probably buy a T-shirt with NASA written on it and walk down the road. I wouldn't walk down the road with I don't know, Department of Education written on my
I
T-shirt.
was just, definite. I was just like, what would you,
yeah. And that's not a criticism, but it just shows how it's lifted out of a government agency and into part of life. And it's the same, we don't talk about the European Space Agency in the same way we talk about NASA. And then there's a legacy bit around, what I did, but even legacy businesses can lose that. So I find those types of examples quite interesting, certainly from a B2B, because it only takes one to really do things differently.
And so the final question around that legacy piece or that memorable piece, for you and for British Land, what makes a place truly memorable and in essence therefore truly valuable to its different audiences?
It's truly memorable if it serves a purpose for the audience, the audience trying to attract. And there are moments of, gosh, that's great. So I think if you turn up to Canada Water, that red bridge is a gosh, that's great moment. Yep. If you come to Regent's Place, the public realm is, wow, like this is, and and you see it on social because you see people take a photo of it and be happily sharing it. So to a certain extent, those, gosh, I wasn't expecting that, that's the bit that adds individual value, but that individual value then becomes more valuable because people want to spend time there. But you're coming back into things being culturally relevant and built for people that you that need to spend time somewhere.
And if you were to give a sort of final pitch for the importance of brand and marketing as a value lever, what would it be?
In a world where trust is being questioned all the time, being in control of your own narrative is hugely important because it means that you are able to communicate effectively and demonstrate what the value is to a number of audiences. You cannot allow that narrative to be taken over by someone else that's interpreting it. And that's the bit I would say marketing and brand plays a really big role, because it's how you show up for your own business or product in a room of people that could be having different views on
or
you.
assumptions on
or
who
assumptions
you are.
on you. And those assumptions, that assumptions piece is huge. That unconscious bias is huge. And we are just consuming so much information. Getting that cut through and communicating that it's the message, it's the design, it's the behaviour, it's all of those elements that form marketing.
Perfect end piece. Pitched it for me. That's perfect.
Well, thank you for having me. That was really enjoyable. Has that gone really quickly?
It has. Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to Bricks and More. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a colleague or friend who would appreciate it. If you're not already, connect with me on LinkedIn, whether to say hello or discuss a destination, real estate, or hospitality project of your own. Finally, please rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Again, share the episode, connect with me on LinkedIn, and rate the podcast. I'm Adrian Strittmatter, and I'll be back soon with the next episode.